As a young civil rights activist, Bernard Lafayette was well seasoned in the philosophy and practice of nonviolent resistance. He was one of several American Baptist Theological Seminary students rising up through the Nashville movement into the public arena. Beginning in the late winter of 1959 and drawing students from four area colleges, the movement began as a result of nonviolent resistance workshops conducted by the Nashville Christian Leadership Council and the Reverend James Lawson at his United Methodist Church. Along with Lafayette, two other seminary classmates would become icons in the civil rights movement: Reverend James Bevel and future Congressman John Lewis. Having participated in a number of protests and lunch counter sit ins, 2 years later, a 21-year-old Lafayette, as well as John Lewis and Diane Nash, among others, would have their training in nonviolent resistance tested to the limit. In May 1961, the Freedom Ride bus in which he was riding from Montgomery, Alabama to Jackson, Mississippi, was attacked by an angry mob of the KKK. Many of the riders, including Lafayette, were severely beaten, all the while practicing what they had been taught. Quickly heading out of Montgomery, the driver suddenly rerouted the bus, as he had been informed that over 2,000 whites were waiting for them if they were to attempt to pass through the small rural town of Selma, Alabama. It was the first time, but not the last, that Lafayette would hear that name. By early 1962, the emboldened and somewhat audacious Lafayette decided to visit the offices of SNCC, that is, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, located in Atlanta, to inquire about available assignments. Not satisfied with what he was being offered, his eyes were drawn to the chalkboard on which, among other towns, the name Selma appeared, but with a large X in front of it. He asked why the X. "We have tried twice to gather the citizens to demand voter rights and be registered to vote, and failed," they said. "Why?" he asked. The response: "Because the whites there are too mean, and the blacks are too afraid." "Well, I'll take that one then." But before he and his new wife would venture to Selma, the young activist knew he needed to understand who the whites were, as well as the general condition of blacks. The White Citizen Council, an expanding white supremacist group birthed in Selma, had a local publication there. But due to Jim Crow laws, he could not use a public library in Atlanta to read it nor to do his other important research. However, it was possible he could obtain access to the library at the Tuskegee Institute, 2 hours northwest, through a locally well-known civil rights activist who was director of the local YMYWCA. The wife of the pastor of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Tuskegee Institute, and accustomed not only to housing foreign students, but freedom riders as well, invited Lafayette to stay in their home at 218 Bibb Street. Using a key she had obtained from the librarian, for 10 days Lafayette would enter the library during off hours. And then, long into the evenings, the young man would sit and talk with his vivacious, highly educated, well-informed, and experienced 45-year-old hostess about social issues, and in particular, the oppression of blacks. In February 1963, Bernard Lafayette and his wife, Kalia, landed in Selma, where he assumed the position of coordinator of voter registration. Within a few months, he and his team of local citizens began conducting mass meetings. Sensing a need for a speaker outside the area for the second one, Lafayette contacted the articulate pastor's wife from Tuskegee Institute, who readily accepted his invitation, saying, "I'll be glad to. Anything I can do to help." As Lafayette describes it, the Baptist church was filled to capacity that day, and the crowd spilled out into the yard. The speaker spoke with passion and conviction as she rallied and encouraged the crowd. But due to her outspokenness, Lafayette feared for her safety, therefore suggesting that she be escorted back to Tuskegee. She declined. 2 hours later, he received a call. She had arrived home safely, Lafayette says. I breathed a sigh of relief, fell to my knees, and said, "Thank you, Lord." Later in July of that same year, Lois Lambert Reeves would return to her hometown of York, Pennsylvania, to help lead a youth gathering at Crispus Attucks, where she had once been employed. A daughter of Faith Presbyterian Church, a month later she would accompany a group from Tuskegee for the famous March on Washington, as her activist parents, Elijah and Edie Lambert, would also depart from York. However, little did any of them know that within that crowd of 500,000 marchers was another young seminarian and civil rights activist, Douglas Parks, who would eventually become the next and final pastor of their beloved Faith Presbyterian, and who, as well, would have his own experience with the infamous Selma and the Edmund Pettus Bridge on none other than Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965.
Happy day when Jesus washed, oh, when he washed, when Jesus washed, he washed my sins away.